My talk is actually on what I call co-responsibility ethics as a driver of responsible innovation. As I already warned you, it will be a somewhat broader talk, which I hope will do some give rise to some reflections in your field. I myself will not be too applicable to the area of robotics because I appreciate your expertise in this area. It's much better that you draw your things as to the field of robotics in far as you think this is useful. Now, first to say where I come from. If you think about generally about ethics of science or ethics of science and technology in general, then I think we face in that field practical and theoretical problems. The first is that classical ethics has always dealt with either the intentionality of individuals or the consequences of the actions of those individuals. For example, you know, which also also illustrates the history of ethics of science and technology. In the beginning, those ethics were very much concerned with, you know, the intentionality of bad scientists doing bad things. You know the Frankenstein story. And then you have others who have concentrated on solely on the consequences of actions. Now, I think both these fields, so those both in both fields of ethics, both who concentrate only on the consequences or those who concentrate on the intentions, is deeply missing the point of science and technology.
Are we still in the first slide? Because we are.
Yes. It's just I just want to give you this general introduction. Sorry. If you talk about science and technology, you can actually either most of the time the results of science and technology not reducible to intentions of individuals anymore. Therefore, science and technology have become too complex. And also the consequences of science and technology in terms of predictable consequences is not the case. Most of the consequences of science and technologies have not been foreseen, and they are the results of collective processes. And so my answer in the end will also go in that direction, that we have to have another type of ethics, which I call an ethics of collective co-responsibility, which is actually a driver of responsible innovation. Now, before coming to that, I want to run to a more practical and conventional type of ethics, which centers around the notions of role responsibility. Individuals fulfill roles in professions and also in scientific professions for which they can become accountable or become responsible in their individual roles. Now, this type of ethics is equally problematic, but very dominant, implicit in the field, and actually also in relation to robotics, where I will come to it, because robotics very often replace a role of an individual, and there our problems start. So what is the essential problems of role responsibility actually? Now, in the history, we see, especially also in the field of science and technology, an enormous proliferation of professions. The amount of roles individuals can take in science and technology has dramatically increased by further differentiations of professions and technical fields. We have, so to speak, an explosion of different roles of individuals. At the same time, the scope of a role an individual can take in our society, especially in the science and technology fields, seem to have narrowed. Let's say I'm coming from the field of biology, and in the past, the idea of being a microbiologist was still a meaningful reference to a professional role. But now, you know, but currently microbiologists are not a sufficient description anymore what somebody is doing. It can be, the person can be occupied with very specific biochemical processes in a particular microorganisms, and has no notions actually what their colleagues are doing in the field. That means actually scientists in generally know much more about less. So knowing more about less, and also knowing less about and less competent about what your colleague actually is doing. Now, at the same time, we see also that the number of temporary roles is increasing. People shift roles rather much more quickly than in the past, shift also field. And so the responsibility taken into a role is very often more associated with the role than with the individual. Now, finally, you see also a role specification within societal systems. So in the systems of science or economy or justice, there the specifications goes very deep, and these social systems themselves become equally distinct from the other social systems, which have become self-regulatory to a large extent. So science is one of those social systems, and they have become, by a large extent, self-regulational. You know, for example, by the notion of excellence when it comes to defining what is good to do in science, where there is no societal interference at all, and the decisions on excellence has to be taken only by individuals who are part of that system. Now, the consequence of these four-dimensional chains of roles are quite dramatic. We see actually that that the responsibility of individuals are still there and taken into their profession, but these four-dimensional aspects of chains in role responsibility has undermined actually this technical system as such. So roles responsibility remains very important, but it weakens actually the normative basis. Now, so we will see further that there is an imbalance between the individual, temporary, and particular roles of individuals, and at the same time, we have to take collective responsibility and some of the simultaneous fulfillment of long-term multiple roles. So the issue of responsibility seems to be quite complex, and some have come to the conclusion that in some cases, no one seems to be responsible for anything anymore because it falls outside their immediate role for which they actually are professionally responsible. In addition, the issues have become so complex that people don't have a sense of accountability anymore when it comes to the consequences of collective actions. You know, you can talk about climate change or other technical complex issues. They are so complex that an individual and the contribution to these outputs are in such a wide distance that people have no sense for it anymore, and also don't feel individually accountable anymore. Now, what does this mean now for robotics and artificial intelligence? I think robots are often represented as taking the role over of an individual, which actually would mean that we could embark into a further journey of further proliferation of roles. This further proliferation means, of course, do we then assign the individual behind the robot is, of course, still responsible. Somebody who owns a robot is obviously still individually accountable, but then suffers, of course, from the same flaws of shortcomings of role responsibility as usual. Now, let's take an example. If you have automated cars, and this is a very common example, probably you all have heard about this, is that we can program them to minimize the risk of the driver. In this case, the responsibility remains with the individual driver, so the whole concept of individual role responsibility remains in place. Now, the other one is that we collectively program cars for all traffic and bring it even into relation to other forms of mobility. And in that case, we actually minimize the risk of accidents in traffic as such. And some have typically described these two choices as an ethical dilemma. Now, I think this is already phrasing the issue as an ethical dilemma refers to a shortcoming in ethical thinking. What is the problem here is that we are too fixed on the idea of individual accountability, which is already, as I shown before, outdated for the science and technology fields. And we have to embark in order to organize ourselves collectively and take over collective responsibility over the outcomes of science and technology to another type of ethics. And if you take the choice, for example, to minimize the risk of all participants in traffic as such, then you make actually a social-political choice to institutionalize another type of responsibility as we dominantly are used to. And I think that would be actually the better option. But this is not the end of the story, because then this question starts: how do we design these systems? Now, now I have to embark you into and draw you into the perspective of responsible innovation. Now, responsible innovation is, I have started thinking about this issue 10 years ago, and the typical thing about science and society issues up till now is that we have normally always focused on, when it comes to new technologies, to either the ethical aspects of it in terms of ELSA aspects, ethical, legal, and safety aspects, as you to some extent also do here, and to the risk of technologies in terms of safety issues. Now, I don't say this is not important, but what is often neglected is actually what we do want to get out of science and technology. What are, as I call, the right impacts? What are the societal desirable outcomes of them? Now, we recently seem to become more aware in our democratic decision processes that the social desirable outcomes are around the Sustainable Development Goals, are around issues of shared public values. But if we realize that, then we also realize that we don't actually drive science and innovations towards them. And this is the new paradigm of science and the new paradigm for responsible innovation. I will shortly highlight what the differences are with current existing paradigms. Now, one existing paradigm is what I call where the state takes the lead in innovation. Let's say a responsible state, a particular type of ethics is behind it, of course. And this you see, for example, in space technologies or in the area of military nuclear use of nuclear technologies, where the socio-economic assessment for governance is actually the benefits for the state, and the governance priorities are to control it and to achieve technological superiority over competitors. I will not go, for time reasons, not go in detail to this. But the more dominant paradigm we have is, of course, a market-driven system where actually, as I said before, the outcomes of the science and technology is not relevant anymore because any innovation is seen as good. It's only the speed of innovation uptake which is relevant for the governance priorities here. And they very often are supported by a key tech-oriented program, as the European Commission did for many years, either to fund technologies in which they hope huge economic benefits. So for a time this was bio, then it became nano, now it's AI, and robotic is of course part of that. So this is associated with a type of ethics which I call an ethics of constraint. This refers back to the ELSA aspects of things, that we look to the ethical aspects of science and technology, but only from an evaluative point of view. We look to the aspects, as the words already say, which is of course good to do. And we have to do this in terms of market innovation because they are the constraints for putting products on the market. We have to overcome the hurdles. But I don't think this is a sufficient perspective. The perspective of responsible innovation is to take the outcomes also into account, and that we take a much more design approach to innovation, in which we try to align our outcomes with generally shared values and of our society and general norms, which actually is not done in our current science and technology policies. I mean, all European policies are actually associated with particular values in the Treaty of the European Union, but science and technology is still seen as an objective in itself. Now, this is where the responsible innovation paradigm takes its criticism from, and so a redirection of science to make science and technology directional again towards particular goals is an objective of the responsible innovation paradigm. And within that paradigm, I think the notion of collective co-responsibility becomes important. The whole aspect of individual accountability is, as I have hoped to illustrate, has become antiquated. We have to organize our responsibilities collectively, and we can actually do that. We can also do it in the sense that it becomes a driver of change, and that ethics is not only a constraint of the market, but becomes a part of the normative design of our technologies, how it looks like. And we have already great examples, especially actually in the ICT fields, where we have, where you have with interactive methods have been able to make technologies aligned with basic values or particular outcomes which people would like to see to come out of technology. Now, my final slides is on what I call anticipatory public governance. And I think now also for the area for robotics, although it remains important, of course, to look to the ELSA aspects, I think we need to go beyond that and organize and institutionalize a form of collective co-responsibility where we go beyond ethics as a constraint of the market and we organize this, for example, by public-partner partnerships, where codes of conduct, for example, can take a role, but also as a balance of privatization. And I think this is very important in the field, notably of AI, where we see in many cases a privatization of algorithm with the consequence that people cannot see what are actually the outcomes, as most dramatically illustrated in the current American justice system, where they use artificial intelligence for predictive criminal behavior of individuals whether they can be released earlier for prison or not. It's decided by private algorithms. Nobody knows how this algorithm look like. So this erodes actually public goods, where responsible innovation actually, of course, has to produce public goods. What I would like to see also in the field of robotics is that we not only look to these ethical aspects of individual robots, but that we look to the system as such and what type of sense we can use robotics for particular societal desirable innovations. So we can do that, of course, with the help of technology assessment and foresight. We have to engage more in a democratic deliberation on alternative futures in which robotics and other technologies can take their place. I already mentioned, so normative participative technology design and value sensitive design, it's actually already working in the field of robotics. I've learned from colleagues. I myself am not an expert in that, but I think this seems to be a positive way out. To conclude with, we have to have a value-driven innovation. So, and these values are typically different than the ethics or values we use in the evaluation of individual products. They are more general, and but they are equally important, and they should drive our innovations. And our current example from Horizon Europe, the new framework program, is that it's organized around, much more organized around what we call mission-oriented research. And I think that's a social innovation in itself, because they are co-designed and co-created by stakeholders. They will work on hopefully open and inclusive research and innovation agendas with a focus on social desirable outputs. And that have been also collectively decided. And I can imagine that in the field of robotics, we can also think of more mission-oriented research, where not the technological potential of the field is central, but the social objective is central, and which we use the technological capacities and our social knowledge to drive these innovations towards these social desirable ends. Now, I hope that you are able to bring this back to your fields. I look forward to the discussion, and I apologize as a philosopher to speak in rather abstract terms from my side, but I hope it triggers off some thinking at your side as well.
Thank you very much.
This is just this is just an advertisement of our book, where Perico Salvini also participated, and 59 other authors, in fact. This is rather expensive, but as ebook it's cheap, and even more cheaper is my website. You can download all kinds of material for free. So sorry to bring this again to the floor, and I look forward to your comments.
Yes, I think it's very educational also for us to keep this in mind when we are working in so specific topics in robotics. Also, we should keep in mind the societal and the ethical dilemmas in each development. We have one question, and I think we can have the time to answer this one. Thank you for your talk, and how to distribute the collective co-responsibility among all the acting parties and stakeholders. Is there a level of responsibility defined for each?
Yes. Well, this is a this is a question right to the point. I think you know, in part of our story on role responsibility, in fact, you know, some roles are actually not fulfilled. This is sometimes also the frustration individuals have. They would like to take over responsibility, but they cannot. And this is where I think some codes of conduct actually can be helpful. They can be helpful in terms of allocating specific responsibilities to individuals. I think also in this field and in other fields, we really need public-private partnerships in which these roles are defined, in which stakeholders come together and not as participants. We have had in the history of our ethics of science technology a lot of talk about public engagement, stakeholder engagement, and so on. But this is not sufficient. It should be a stakeholder commitment towards a particular societal outcome. And this also then also predefines already the role they can take. So I think this responsibility, taking over responsibility, will need to take place in these frameworks. And I emphasize the role of public-private partnerships because I'm afraid that currently, when it comes to it, let's take the field of AI more narrowly, then the battle will be between Google and Alibaba from China, and all our innovations will be driven by global markets mechanisms from which we are more object of change than agent of change. So we have to counterbalance this.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk and for your opinion on this topic. And I think this will be very interesting to continue in the open discussions after the last talks. Thank you very much. Now,
thank you, Diego. Thank you for enduring my talk.
No, it was quite interesting. I think it's important to everyone developing new technologies to keep this in mind.